I have a Drake Fortnite joke, and it would kill in a 6th grade classroom. Welcome, nerds, to another episode of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a weekly nerd culture podcast that discusses the culture through various segments. My name, of course, is Patrick Kuhn, and I'm alongside my co-host, as always, that Tyler Hunt. How's it going, man?
It is going pretty well, man. How are you?
I'm good. I realized as soon as I said my name and introduced you that we've been trying to pimp our other stuff in the intro of the podcast, because we know you motherfuckers aren't listening at the very end. So you can follow us on, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com, which is kind of just the hub of everything the nerds you're looking for. We have the YouTube channel. We have both of our letterbox, which you can follow me at The Nerds Podcast. You can also follow Tyler at that Tyler Hunt, and you have all the star ratings for every movie we've ever officially reviewed on the podcast, and among other things. We have a lot of stuff on that website, so definitely check that out. And then, of course, you can check out, like I said, our YouTube channel, The Nerds You're Looking For. So, Tyler, how are you today, man?
that was a weird segue. I'm okay, man. It's a busy week of work, but obviously it's a big weekend. This episode will be reviewing Ant-Man and the Wasp, and we only get to do a Marvel Cinematic Universe review twice or 3 times a year, and I've been looking forward to this episode for sure since we got done with Infinity War in April. So I'm feeling pretty good. How have you been?
Not too bad. I do have to warn our listeners that my wife may or may not be mowing the lawn while we record. So all of you husbands out there, you're basically playing for second for husband of the year, because I'm making my wife mow the lawn right now while we record. So I apologize. She only has a little bit left because apparently she started it yesterday, and we have one of those cool battery powered lawnmowers, but the battery kind of sucks, so you have to do it in chunks because our backyard apparently is too big for that little tiny battery to handle. So she's gonna finish it up, so it should only be a few more minutes. But I say that I'm making her. She offered to do it. She does it once or twice a summer. She'll just be like, hey, by the way, I know you're busy, so I'll mow the lawn this time. So she always says it like she's a martyr, it's that big of a deal. I was like, I do it every other week. So yeah, it's not that big of a deal.
I was curious if it was a situation where you were like, I'm recording the podcast this morning and you're mowing the lawn. So that's our day. So it's good to know that it was, like you said, her playing the martyr this weekend in the heat and doing it. When
I mow the lawn, I bitch about it because that's my default setting. I love complaining. It's my favorite thing to do in the world. So it's been getting ridiculously hot, and it's been raining a lot here in Evansville. So it's been really super muggy all the time. So it's been a pain in the ass to mow. But yesterday when I was at work, she started mowing, and she was sending me Snapchats of all the bug bites she got and stuff like that. I was like, you're being a little bitch right now.
Dude, that is the game changer with moving to Cleveland. Is one, it's not been as humid up here as what it was back in Evansville when I visited a couple weeks ago. But out of all the times, I've been outside running, I've been outside working in the yard and grilling, I've had one bug bite this year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a complete difference from Southern Indiana. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just because it's less humid or what, but just not as many mosquitoes. It's been awesome.
And you don't have to live in a pretend city.
I don't know. I kind of live in a pretend city. It's a nice place.
I would describe Cleveland as a garbage city. It's a real city. It's just garbage.
In all fairness, I don't live in Cleveland. I live in Medina. But yes, I don't disagree. So
All right, man. So let's just jump right into it. If this is your first episode, we kind of just start off each episode by just checking in with each other. We call it what we're into. So what are you into this week?
forgot for a second what I was going to talk about and had like a mini heart attack. So if you guys recall, last summer, I talked about Glow Season 1 on Netflix, and I talked about how much I really loved that first season. And this week, I figured I would talk about Glow Season 2 because it came out a couple weeks ago, and I finished it up last weekend. And this is a season of television that I was looking forward to quite a bit once it was announced for renewal. Season 1's entire buildup was to the creation of this women's wrestling show. So I was excited to see in Season 2 how these characters would respond to being full-fledged professional wrestlers with a TV show in Season 2. So that's where, as I go through this, it might get a little confusing because I'm going to go back and forth between talking about the Netflix show Glow and then the show Glow that these characters are making in make-believe world. So I'll try to differentiate as best I can. But with Season 2, I really liked the dynamic. The characters involved with this show that they're making are struggling to keep it on the air, and they're all trying to leave their creative imprint as well. So I thought that created some pretty cool character moments as they kind of fought for creative power. Speaking of power, a power shift in this season as well, as one of the female leads of the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling also becomes a producer on the show. So, I forget her name. Debbie. Debbie becomes a producer. She's the one who plays the America character, the American wrestling character on the show. So that leads to some interesting character moments as well, because she has more of a creative say and to what they're doing with the wrestling than the other ladies do. This show is definitely an ensemble, and I thought that most of the interweaving storylines with each character were really great. Obviously, there's a lot of story to tell whenever you're focusing on 10 to 12 different characters. Some storylines obviously carried more weight than others, but the show definitely carried the momentum of the first season and that it was very entertaining. I also love that this show is set in the 80s. You know, those were the glory days for wrestling, so there were definitely some fun moments to be had with that time frame. You know, I mentioned that this is an ensemble cast, so from a performance standpoint, Allison Brie is perfect on the show. She's so great as both her civilian character and then as her wrestling character, Zoya the Destroyer. She's amazing. Betty Gilpin, who I mentioned, plays Debbie, and I don't know why I'm blanking on her character's name, but like I said, the American character, she's fantastic as well. I wasn't very familiar with her before Glow, and she carries a lot of weight in the show. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Marc Maron. He is just phenomenal. He is so funny on this show, and I hate like focusing on like the one guy in a female ensemble cast, but he is amazing. He's really hilarious. And then, you know, besides those three leads, the supporting cast is really great too. And I mentioned it when I was talking about the storylines, but it's great because all of them kind of have their moments to shine throughout the season. One example specifically centers on Tammy Dawson, who plays the Gorgeous Lady of Wrestling character Welfare Queen, which, you know, she's played by real life pro wrestler Kaya Stevens. And the episode with her, I think it's like episode 3 or 4, shows her relationship with her college student son. He goes to Stanford, and his reaction to her not only being a professional wrestler, but portraying a character that is a very, very terrible stereotype of African American people. So it's a very heartfelt story interwoven into the insanity of the show, and you kind of get that in little bits and pieces. It's very similar to like the WWF in the 80s, in that, you know, most of the ethnic characters on the show play very racist stereotypes of their ethnicity when it comes to their character in the wrestling program. So there is some humor there, but also it kind of makes you cringe a little bit as well. I also wanted to point out while talking about season 2, episode 8, it's called the Good Twin, and it started out really fun. It plays like an actual episode of the fictional Glow show. So it's like you're watching it on TV, like just a regular episode of the series. And it's a really cool concept, and it's a nice break from all of the storylines going on in this season, but I will say that I lost my interest about 10 or 15 minutes into it. It was cute for a while, but I don't really want to see 30 plus minutes of a fake 80s wrestling show that is purposefully cheesy and bad. So it definitely overstayed its welcome, but it was a cool idea. But yeah, I mean, needless to say, as I'm sure I'm coming across, I was a pretty big fan of season 2 overall. It consists of 10 30-minute episodes, so it's not a huge commitment. And yeah, I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah, I think when you talked about this show with season 1, I mentioned that I had also watched some of it. I had not finished it because, and I don't know if I necessarily dislike the show. I just went into it thinking it was going to be what you described as the second season. Like there was way too much lead up for me to get to the actual wrestling. And I'm not a huge wrestling fan by any means. I wouldn't even describe Tyler as a huge wrestling fan, but he is far and away the bigger wrestling fan than the two of us. I don't really give a shit about wrestling at all. I went to a WWF show, and I literally, it shows you how big of a wrestling fan I am. I had to literally think of what the initials were. But when they came to Louisville at one point, when I was in like junior high or something like that, and that was my biggest like wrestling moment. I basically, what I know of wrestling, I know from the 64 wrestling games, Warzone, and then WrestleMania, I believe is the second one. So that is all of my wrestling knowledge comes from those two video games, which those games were amazing, by the way. But like Glow, I think was marketed wrong going into that first season because there's not a ton of wrestling. It's really kind of the lead up to the show, at least what I watched. I think I got through like 4 or 5 episodes. So I didn't get through much of the first season, but I just expected more of like the actual show than the kind of the lead up to the show. And maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I do talk a lot about how I love character development, and that was kind of what they were doing in those first few episodes of the first season. I just didn't really attach myself to these characters and didn't really get into it. And it sounds like I'm in the very, very small minority that didn't really get into this show because it's doing really, really well.
Yeah, that being said, I don't think they've been renewed for a season 3 yet, and season 2 definitely, I wouldn't say it lands on a cliffhanger, but it definitely sets up a big storyline for season 3. So it's people like you that are the reason that it's not picked up yet. So I hope that it gets picked up for season 3. I hope Netflix continues to produce this show, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I read an article the other day that said that Netflix was going to spend more money than all of the studios combined or something, or maybe they already have. I don't remember, but it was like $13 billion or something like that in the next few years, or maybe it was even just next year alone, which seems a little crazy to me on original programming. So if Glow doesn't get picked up, it sounds like it's going to be kind of a surprise for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil season 2 and what happens at the end of the season 2, but I think season 3 would be something you'd be interested in because it promises to take a look at Las Vegas in the 80s.
Oh yeah.
So it might
fun.
be something. Yeah, it might be something you like. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing a Glow season 3 next summer. But what are you into, man?
So I kind of went back and forth about whether or not I was going to talk about Fortnite Battle Royale because obviously it's this huge deal and Tyler's talked about it before. But there's actually a new game mode that I kind of want to focus some of my attention on. But before I get into that, if you've essentially been living under a rock, and not even living under a rock, but you would literally have to live under a rock and put your head in the sand to not know what Fortnite Battle Royale is. Because I've literally never seen a game like take over pop culture like Fortnite has taken over. Maybe Pokemon Go was close to it. But like video games, like it is becoming more and more popular, obviously, but it's still, as far as pop culture is concerned, it's still kind of a niche audience. So I don't think I've ever seen a video game take over pop culture like Fortnite Battle Royale has. So if you haven't played it yet, you're one of the few. But essentially, it's a battle royale mode, a game. You get dropped in with you and like 90 plus other people, and it's kind of the last man standing sort of thing, kind of like Hunger Games would be, except for when you get dropped in, all you have is a pickaxe and a glider, and you use the pickaxe to harvest materials. You can harvest wood, stone, and steel. And you use those materials to build structures to help you take down the other enemies in the game that got dropped in as well. And you can also find weapons and ammo and that kind of stuff. So I've been playing this game a lot for the last like 3 or 4 months. I know Tyler plays it occasionally when they him and his buddies get together and play on Monday nights. So he is familiar with this game as well, and we do stream it occasionally on a Fortnite Friday here and there. We haven't done one in a while, but yeah, we are planning on doing that again. So I went solo this Fortnite Friday and did not go well for multiple reasons. Mostly because the streaming website that I used to stream on YouTube, Twitch, and Mixer all at the same time decided to just shit the bed and didn't tell me. So everything looked fine on my end, but it wasn't fine. And so it was kind of a shit show. But anyways, I'm kind of late to the party with this game. I struggled with it a lot. Like that was kind of the thing. Like I was like, oh man, this is such a popular game. It's really fun. I should stream this more often. But I assumed that because it's so popular that, oh, well, that'll bring a lot of people to the channel. And that was not the case, mostly because the more I thought about it, I'm a fucking turd at this game. And like nobody wants to watch like this super popular game somebody play it so bad like I was playing it a few months ago, just because it is so popular and there's so many people out there that play it so much better than me. And so I realized that I kind of took a break from it for a while, and not a break from playing the game, but a break from streaming it, just because I was like, I need to get better at this game. And so I worked really hard, but for the most part, it's still kind of the concept of building is still a really foreign concept to me. Like I know that that's a big part of the game, and I know like when you watch these streamers, like when they start getting in gun battles, they immediately build and try to get the high ground, and that's how they win these battles. And for me, that's just not second nature to me. Like they just recently, I play on Xbox, and for a long time, when you went to build, you would have to like cycle through like the walls and the floors and the ramps and all that stuff. And it would take you a half second to build, where PC players can build immediately because they have macros on their keyboards. So they recently came up with a new controller configuration where you don't have to cycle anymore, and that's really helped. But building still hasn't become muscle memory for me. And I've talked about this before, I think, on the podcast. Like when I play Madden, I've been playing that game for so long that if somebody were to ask me, oh, like, how do you do this thing? Like, I've seen you do this thing in the game before. How do you do it? I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I can't tell you the buttons I press because I'm not thinking, oh, I got to press Y to do this. I just do it because it's muscle memory. And building for me in Fortnite just hasn't gotten to that point yet. It's getting better. Like when I was streaming on Friday, I feel like I'm kind of turning the corner with that. And the reason for that is because they just recently announced and released a playground mode, which essentially I'm going to tell you how most people play this mode, and then I'm going to tell you how I play it. And how I play it is pretty lame. But so essentially, in Fortnite Battle Royale, you can play, I think, 3 different modes. You can do solos, which is usually what I do, duos, which is what Tyler and I do when we stream on Fortnite Friday, and squads, which is you and 3 other players play other teams of 4. And the playground mode is set up for squads. Essentially, you and 3 other friends get dropped in the map by yourself, and most people play it so they can they work together and they can build some crazy shit, or they can just play the 4 of them. And I don't play it like that. I basically drop in and I don't fill the squad. So it's just me on the island by myself. And what I use it for is, and this is kind of embarrassing, but basically I try to simulate situations where I'm getting attacked. And so I start practicing building, and I build different structures and stuff like that. And so I feel like I'm starting to get better at the building aspect of this game, which is super, super important. Like I said, it's a big aspect of this game, and I feel like I'm starting to turn the corner because of playground mode. I think it's really fun and a really good idea because I've been clamoring for it for a while because people like me that aren't good at this game, there's no way before playground mode to really practice, because if you dropped in, what I was doing is I would like drop in like a really secluded area and try to practice doing stuff. But then if somebody stumbled across you, first of all, you look like a fucking weirdo just building at this random spot in the map. But also, like, I want to just build shit. Like, just leave me alone. I don't want to be a part of this. Just like, let me build and do my own thing. And then, of course, you have the storm to deal with too. So eventually I would have to move closer and closer. So I think the playground mode is really cool because it allows people like me to practice. And it also allows people to kind of just chill with their friends and build weird shit. So I think it's a great idea. Unfortunately, it's going away. I think by the time this episode comes out, I think it'll be like one more day. They're going to take it away again. And then I think they're going to make some changes so you can actually like do 2v2. Like when you drop in with 3 other buddies, you can do 2v2 and it lets you customize your playground a little bit more. So I think that's a cool idea. But like I said, I kind of use it like a turd.
Yeah, I had no idea whenever I talked about this game. I think like back at January, it was one of our first episodes of the year, that it would become this phenomenon that it has become. So that's one thing that I think keeps this game going, is they introduce new things and then they take them away, and then they just keep it fresh. It's not just a stagnant game. So you have things like Playground, or you have things like the tie-in to Infinity War back in April that you can play for a limited time that draws people in. But at the end of the day, it's really just a fun game. Like, and I think that's why it has such a lasting power. It was free for a long time, and I think it still is free, at least just the version with the Battle Royale. And yeah, it's pretty impressive what they've done with this game and how they've suckered so many people into playing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy how it's kind of taken over pop culture. Like, it's big enough where, so I'm obviously a huge gamer, and I also dabble in stand-up, and so there's occasions where I'm like, oh man, I've been playing this game, and I'll be like, well, I have this funny bit that I could do in my stand-up, but I never do those things because how many times am I going to go to this dive bar and people are going to get this video game reference that I'm making? Very, very little audience is going to get those references. And a lot of times if you don't get the reference, obviously you're not going to get the joke. But I do have a couple of Fortnite jokes. Now, when I do go to these dive bars, there's not a ton of people that get them, but I have more confidence that people are going to get Fortnite jokes than any other video game material that I have.
Yeah, you should like try those out in a 6th grade classroom. I think they'd go over really
They
well.
would fucking kill.
They would, man.
I have a Drake Fortnite joke, and it would kill in a 6th grade classroom.
That's awesome, man.
All right, so our next segment is just plainly called Comics. We read a ton of comics each week, and we like to spotlight one or two. So what'd you read this week?
I read Batman number 50, which is written by Tom King. And so for those of you not following along, Batman 50 was the wedding between Batman and Catwoman. And in my opinion, I think this is arguably the biggest comic so far this year, and the one that has generated the most conversation online. I really don't want to spoil anything that happens in this issue, although the New York Times didn't mind doing that a few days before the comic was even available. But either way, I did want to bring it up because I can genuinely say that I still find myself thinking about it days after reading it, and that doesn't happen with me too often anymore whenever I read comics. So this issue was, of course, like the culmination of a big buildup. Bruce and Selena have been engaged in real time now for over a year at this point. And from an issue standpoint, I mean, at least it seems like 20 to 25 issues. So obviously all of those storylines leading up from that point kind of intersect in Batman 50, and all of the issues leading up to Batman 50 were really important from a relationship standpoint, because it has to do with them exploring the possibility of them getting married, and then of course their relationship so far. So like when you think about Batman and Catwoman or Bruce and Selina, this is a romance that is basically 70 years in the making, and this particular comic does a really good job of celebrating that. So some of my favorite Batman issues came out of the storytelling leading up to Batman 50, including the annual from last year that I talked about on the podcast and loved. And then there were also some great character moments throughout those issues with like Superman and Lois Lane and Dick Grayson and Alfred and Damian that I thought were really important because it explored Bruce's relationship with those peoples as he kind of got ready for the biggest day of his life. So those issues leading up to this marriage also got to dive more into the psyche of Selina and Bruce. And I especially love one of the issues that I forget what the number is, but it has to do with Selina kind of just evaluating herself and evaluating this relationship. And she ends up stealing her wedding dress just because that's who she is at heart, even though she's mostly a quote unquote good guy now. So with all that being said, I've talked a lot about the issues leading up to Batman 50 and have not really talked about that issue particularly. Essentially, Batman 50 is a bit longer than most issues. Like typically these bi-weekly issues are $2.99. This one is $5. So there is a little bit more story there. And it interweaves two themes. So the first theme is the story of the prep that Bruce and Selina are doing to get ready for their marriage. One night they just decide to go ahead and get married. After they get done beating up Kite Man, they decide to just get a judge and two witnesses, and the story kind of follows them leading up to the end of that night. So Bruce brings Alfred, which is pretty sentimental, and then Selina breaks her friend Holly Robinson out of Arkham to be her witness. So all of that's going on, and then that is being interweaved by the second theme, which is that the story is broken up by pages that include snippets of a letter that Batman and Catwoman have each written each other. So it's really great storytelling, and at this point I expect nothing less from Tom King. And unfortunately I can't really talk any more about the story itself, but I do want to touch on the art in this issue because it's phenomenal. The main art is done by, I don't know if it's Michael or Mikkel, so we'll go with Mikkel, Janine, and June Chung. But like I mentioned, this story is broken up by these excerpts of the letters of that Bruce and Selina wrote each other. And every time that they go to a splash page with the dialogue from the letters, the page's artwork is done by a different comic artist. And some of these artists are some of the greatest comic artists working today. So almost every single splash page was a print that I would hang on my wall if I was able to. And they all do an amazing job of celebrating these characters. So for the record, these artists that each did a page for this comic include Frank Miller, Neil Adams, Andy Kubert, Tim Sale, Clay Mann, Ty Templeton, David Finch, Jim Lee, and of course Greg Capullo. So obviously a very talented roster there. Reading this issue, it's very noticeable that there was a lot of love put into this story that is celebrating the love of two characters that comic readers adore. And while this is a huge culmination of a lot of storytelling, Tom King has said that this is a 100 issue story. So I'm definitely excited for the next 50 issues that continue to explore what happens at the end of Batman 50 that, again, I will not spoil.
Yeah, so obviously I knew that this issue was coming up, and I was determined to make sure that I was caught up on Batman because it's getting a little ridiculous, it being bi-weekly, and that and Flash I've gotten really, really backed up on because it's easy when they're bi-weekly as much as we read, even though we've been talking a lot about cutting stuff out, which I have, but obviously I'm never going to cut out Batman, so it's really easy to get backed up. That being said, I did not get caught up in time, so I'm a little bit disappointed in myself, but I have been liking a lot of the stuff. I was a little skeptical of Tom King at first just because he followed Scott Snyder, of course, who basically did the best run of Batman I think we'll see in a long time, or at least that's what I thought, but I think he's done a phenomenal job following that run of Batman, so I'm definitely intrigued to eventually get caught up, and I'm glad to hear that it was good and that a lot of care and love was put into it.
Yeah, my biggest advice to you would be, I don't know how backed up you are, but try to avoid spoilers. I mentioned that the New York Times spoiled it. I guess they had early access to the issue and they spoiled it in their headline, like on Sunday of last weekend. So like 3 days before it actually came out.
Bold strategy.
Yeah. Luckily, I wasn't spoiled by it. I had just saw that Tom King tweeted about it. So I went in fresh, and that's how I would recommend going into anybody who hasn't read it, because otherwise, if you know how it ends, I think that it kind of takes away from the actual issue for sure. So that being said, what'd you read?
So I have been talking about a lot of number ones pretty much exclusively for the last, I would say, it seems like maybe even a year. Like it's almost every week I'm just looking for a new number one to talk about. Luckily, this week I am not going to talk about a number one. I'm actually going to follow up on one of the many number ones that I've talked about recently, and that is Death or Glory number 3. I kind of talked a little bit to Tyler about this before we started recording, is I keep saying, oh, like, I really like this, I'm going to keep up with it, and then I never keep up with it. Luckily for me, I think, because I really enjoyed this book, I did keep up with Death or Glory. So I'm going to kind of talk about issue number 2 and 3. But before I get into that, if you're not aware, if you don't remember that episode that we did I guess it would have been a couple of months ago by now, when I talked about number 1, Death or Glory is about a woman named Glory who needs money for surgery for her father. And she basically robs these what she thinks are drug dealers, and there's a big cliffhanger at the end of issue 1 that I still don't want to spoil because it is a very big deal, and my review of issue 2 and 3 don't really need to include that spoiler, so I'm going to go ahead and try to be vague, at least when that as far as that's concerned. So we've been trying to do this better the last few months. This book, Death or Glory, was put out by Image Comics, and it was written by Rick Remender. And I know for a fact that this book came out before I started to mention the writer and artist on every episode, because the artwork for this book, and you mentioned this a while back when I don't remember what book it was, but you had an artist named Hi-Fi, which obviously that's not his given name. This wasn't done by Hi-Fi. It was done by an artist that goes by Bengal. Bengal. Bengal.
Like the tiger?
Yeah, like the fucking tiger. So I was like, there's no way I said Bengal and didn't make a big deal out of it the last time I talked about this. So I know that must have been before we were starting to like really put an effort out there to mention the writer and the artist. So yeah, Bengal the tiger does a really great job with the artwork. I really appreciate his or her artwork, but yeah, change your fucking name. That's really super douchey. But anyways, I really enjoy this book. I think that it definitely starts off with a bang with issue number 1. And of course, we've talked a lot about number 1 issues and kind of what they have to do to grab our attention. And I thought Death or Glory did a really good job with that. And they kind of peel back some of the layers in the second issue. It definitely slows down a lot in the second issue, but like I've said a million other times, is I really like character development, and you really get to see the relationship between Glory and her father, Red, as he's called in the book, and kind of why they are the way that they are. They talk a lot about in issue 1 that they've lived essentially her entire life kind of off the grid, like completely off the grid. They don't have social security numbers. They don't have bank accounts. They have nothing. They live completely off the grid. Red was a truck driver, and he basically, the only people that he trusts is like this truck driver group that they're in called the Convoy. And essentially Glory has basically not been able to interact with anybody other than the people in Convoy. And you kind of find the reason out why in issue number 2, and it does hit pretty hard, especially for me personally. And then issue number 3 kind of really takes up the tone again, like really picks up the pace that issue number 1 kind of left off with. So I definitely appreciate the character development in issue number 2, and I really am excited to see where this goes in further issues.
Yeah, this is one I might have to go back and pick up. It definitely sounds interesting for sure. So even though the artist is pretentious and goes by Bingle.
Yeah, I wanted to look it up. Like, I wanted to see if that was like his or her given name, so I'm not a complete asshole for making fun of it. But I never did that, and I am an asshole, so I figured I would just go with it.
It's funny because I talked about whenever in Batman 50, all of these artists that contributed artwork to it, and Hi-Fi was one of the artists that,
Oh, really?
that did, and I left his or her name off the list whenever I went through those artists.
Yeah, that's awesome. They deserve it. They don't deserve credit if they're going to go by Hi-Fi.
Yeah, it reminds me of that actress Aquafina, who's in Ocean's 8. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No, because I didn't ever see Ocean's 8.
She's all, I don't know. I guess she's been in other things, but yeah, she goes by Aquafina, but it's AWK Wafina, so like awkward. But yeah, that's really really dumb. So don't do
For
that.
sure. But this book is really good, despite the artist's name.
All right, you ready for nerd news?
Yeah, what do you got this week?
I did not have a whole lot. I think that because it was a holiday week, it was very slow news-wise, and you will be able to tell that by the first two stories that I have. So the first just kind of caught me off guard because I didn't realize there was this much interest in Child's Play. But apparently, not only are they doing a Child's Play reboot movie that's going to be done by the producers of It and MGM that follows like a new doll that's like smart, I guess, not possessed, but smart. It's going to torture a group of kids a la It. In addition to that movie that they're doing, that reboot that they're doing, they're also doing a Child's Play series at Universal with like the original continuity of the Child's Play movies. So I thought that people had just kind of given up on Chucky. Like there had been a couple direct-to-video movies over the last few years, but yeah, now there's like a TV spinoff show and a reboot movie coming, which is just insane to me.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this last October. I made a big deal out of watching all of the Chucky movies because it was a series that I had seen, I think the first two when they first, well, not necessarily when they first came out, but when I was a little kid, I really liked the first two movies and I watched them quite a lot, but I hadn't seen the rest of the franchise. And so I was definitely interested in seeing them. And Bride of Chucky and Seed of Chucky are probably the two of the dumbest movies I've ever seen in my entire life. Like they were really hard to get through, especially Seed of Chucky is by far the dumbest movie I've ever seen. And I think I can say that with pretty good confidence that there's not a movie dumber than that movie. Yeah, I really enjoyed Cult of Chucky, which is the one that you're referring to. The one that I believe, I don't know if it was a Netflix original or what, but it was on Netflix and I watched it last October and I was surprised at how much I liked it, especially following Bride and Seed, because I was pretty much done with the franchise after those two fucking movies. But I had heard good things about Cult of Chucky, and I really enjoyed that movie. It kind of went back to the horror roots. Like, it got super, super stupid and campy in the other two movies that I mentioned, and I really appreciated how Cult of Chucky went back to the actual horror roots of the franchise, because Child's Play 1 especially was all about atmosphere and really kind of I mean, it's a silly concept anyways, but it really did as well as I think you could, just to make it tension filled and have a lot of atmosphere and just be a really well done horror movie. And of course it went completely off the rails later in the franchise, but I did appreciate Cult of Chucky, and I'm definitely looking forward to the new shows. Did you mention there was two of them?
Well,
they're going to be remake the movie.
There's the
and
reboot. There's a reboot movie, and there's a show. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm definitely
thanks for listening, bud.
I couldn't remember if they were both TV shows or if there was a movie and a TV show. That was what I was confused about. But I did kind of listen to you. But anyways, I'm definitely looking forward to them as long as they kind of follow the Cult of Chucky or the original Child's Play movie, that type of horror movie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. I can't imagine a show based on this concept is going to be that amazing, but the reboot kind of makes me cringe. a little bit. Whenever you look at all of the big horror franchises like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Child's Play and so on and so forth, like Child's Play is the one that's never been rebooted. Like it's the same continuity as the movie that came out in the 80s. So I'm a bit bummed that they're rebooting it, but I'm glad to know that continuity will continue on with the show.
For sure.
Cool. So this story, I didn't want to do it, but I wanted to have at least 3 stories this week. So apparently they are making a live action CGI hybrid movie based on Sonic the Hedgehog. And
Yes.
Jim Carrey is going to play Dr. Robotnik.
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about how I'm a huge gamer and I play a ton of different games, but Sonic was never a game that I really ever got into, mostly because as a kid, growing up, we were really poor, and so we had a Nintendo. We never got a Sega, and Sonic was always a Sega thing, so I never really played it too much. I ended up playing it a little bit later, like when I was in high school. I got a Sega Genesis just and like at a Goodwill, and I think I got like Mortal Kombat 2 and then just a random Sega, or not Sega game, Sonic game. I don't even remember which one it was, and I played it for like an hour, and that's pretty much my history with the franchise. So I honestly, first of all, it's a stupid idea. Second of all, I don't care about it at all because I was never attached to the franchise to begin with. They look like fun platformer games, and I do really like that genre, but I just never got into Sonic.
Yeah, I mean, I always liked Sonic. I didn't have a Sega either, but I played it at friends' houses, and then I think there was a cartoon at one point that I watched when I was younger that I got into. So yeah, I mean, I never disliked Sonic by any means, but I mean, I'm not going to see this movie unless we have to see it to review it. I don't plan on seeing it. So yeah, like I said, definitely a filler headline. So last story I have before we move on to our main topic, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the passing of Steve Ditko. He passed away at the age of 90 in his home in New York. He is, of course, the artist that co-created a lot of characters that we love in the comics, most notably Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and many others as well. But yeah, I wanted to bring that up. And, you know, it's funny because I got out of Ant-Man and the Wasp and then saw that on my phone, like as soon as I got done watching a movie that, you know, could be argued was very much inspired by his work. So that being said, just from an honesty standpoint, I did not realize he was still alive. He was very reclusive, I think from like the 70s on, and he didn't do interviews. He obviously didn't celebrate in the popularity of his work with these films. I know Scott Derrickson tweeted that he never got to talk to him when he was making the Doctor Strange movie, but he hoped that he watched it and liked it. But yeah, I was not aware that the man was still alive, which is sad because he obviously had an impact on a lot of people with his work.
Yeah, so I was pretty upset when I heard the news. Obviously, I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, as well as Tyler is. I didn't really know a whole lot about him other than the fact that he helped create Spider-Man. I literally have one of his covers, the Fantastic Four Spider-Man Chameleon Strikes cover that he did. It's kind of his, I would say, probably one of his most famous works on my wall. Like I have like a little, like a canvas. I don't know exactly how you would what you would call it, but like obviously he has had a huge impact in my life, even though I didn't really know a whole lot about him. Like you said, he very much wanted to be out of the spotlight and didn't really get into all of the hype around the movies and whatnot. And so it doesn't surprise me that I didn't know a whole lot about him and that a lot of people didn't know a whole lot about him. I was, like you, kind of surprised that he was still alive. I mean, Stan Lee's getting up there, so obviously they co-created Spider-Man together, so it is a little bit surprising that he was still alive, but it's still a bummer, especially coming around, like, we only get to see a few MCU movies a year, and right around Ant-Man, it kind of put a damper on that a little bit for me.
Yeah, definitely disappointing, man. But obviously he contributed a lot to a lot of people, and it was really awesome to like scroll through my Twitter feed and see all of the comic book writers and artists that were inspired by him tweeting about how great his work was. So yeah, he'll definitely be remembered for forever with the characters that he helped create. So
for sure.
All right, man, that's all I got.
All right, so we are going to, as Tyler mentioned earlier, we're going to review Ant-Man and the Wasp. But before we get started, there was a segment, and Tyler doesn't know that I'm going to do this, so he's going to be completely surprised. So there was a segment that we do every once in a while called Trailer Trash, and there is a trailer that I finally saw that I know Tyler has seen because he yelled about it while we were drinking at Indie PopCon that weekend. I finally saw the Bumblebee trailer, and I feel like I need to trash it a little bit because, first of all, I just like to mess with Tyler. Second of all, I honestly don't get why you like that trailer so much. First of all, my biggest problem with this is it's a prequel to the Transformers movies. And is it just me, or does Bumblebee look smaller in this trailer? Like, are they going for like him being like a teenager? Because if they are, it's stupid because he's a fucking robot and robots don't grow.
I didn't even pay attention to that. I haven't seen a Transformers movie in so long. I don't remember his size.
Yeah, he's definitely smaller in this, at least the trailer. And if they're going with like he's a teenager in this movie, then that's fucking stupid because robots don't grow.
I think it has to do with the first movie where he like scans and he takes on the model of whatever car he scans. So he's just a little bug in this movie, man. He's a little car.
But isn't he that in the first one too? In the first
but then
Transformers?
he scans the Camaro.
So he would be the same size.
Dude,
how do robots grow? Let's be honest. Like, how do they grow? Do robots get pregnant? Where do they keep their penises? Like, it provides more questions than answers, and it bothers it. Like, that's the thing. Like, all jokes aside, that's the thing that's really bothered me, among other things, with the Transformers franchise, is the fact that they try to give them human qualities. Like in the second one, I think it was the second one where like they come across like one of the original Transformers, and he has like, they try to make him look like an old man. It's like he's a fucking robot. He doesn't get any older. So that's the kind of stuff that really bugs me about this franchise, again, among other things, is they try to give these robots human qualities, and it bothers me so much. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe he isn't any smaller in the trailer, and if that's the case, then it's a fine trailer, but that really bugs me.
Is that really the only issue you had?
Yeah, because robots don't get fucking bigger.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess they were ahead of the curve, because isn't that what Westworld's doing, is giving robots human qualities?
Those are androids. That's different.
No, I mean, obviously, I don't think that we ever talked about the trailer on the podcast. All of our bickering back and forth was at Indie PopCon. I was, whenever I watched it, I was like, how dare you want me, get me to go see another Transformers movie? Because obviously we've sworn those movies off, and like they're so bad, but I don't know what it is about that movie. I just like the idea of Bumblebee and that girl having a connection. It reminds me of Iron Giant, like I said.
Yeah, you screamed at me.
That being said, I don't like when they do this with prequels, because so this takes place in the 80s, right? So that girl is a grown woman by the time that the events take place in the Transformers movie that came out in like 2006 or 2007. So where the fuck is she? Does she die? Or does she just fuck off and her and Bumblebee don't like each other anymore? So like just those types of things is what bugs me the most. I do think that it looks like it might tell an okay story. But yeah, we'll see if what we have going on the week that it comes out, if we end up reviewing it or not.
I'm not going to fucking review that movie. I will take a week off from
That's
the
bullshit,
podcast.
because I put my foot down about Walking Dead before you did, and I still had to review that bullshit season like a year ago. So you owe me one if I decide we want to.
Do you really want to cash in on fucking Bumblebee?
We'll see.
All right. So like I said, we are actually going to review Ant-Man and the Wasp, which of course is a sequel to Ant-Man, which was also directed, like this movie was, by Peyton Reed, who did, among other movies, I did not know this, but he did Bring It On. That weird cheerleader movie. I did not know that about him, but yes, he did that movie as well. And of course, this is the 20th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Paul Rudd is back as Scott Lang, who is on house arrest following a plea deal due to his involvement in Captain America: Civil War. However, he must find a way around that in order to make things right between him and Hope and Hank. So, like we say with all the MCU movies and Star Wars and so many others, we are obviously excited to see this movie. And I think that I liked the Ant-Man, the first movie, more than I think most people did. I think that most people think of it as kind of the weaker link in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I actually really, really enjoyed the first one. I was a little bit more anxious to see this movie than I originally thought I would, leading up to it maybe a couple of years ago, mostly because I wasn't quite sure how they were going to rationalize him not being in Infinity War. And of course, I'm going to get to that later, but I was a little bit more anxious than I thought I was going to be going into this movie.
Yeah, I was really excited for this movie. I also love the first Ant-Man. I know you pimped our Letterboxd accounts earlier in the episode, but on my Letterboxd account, I have the Marvel Cinematic Universe ranked, and
so do I.
And it's not going to
stole
sound
that
like
idea from you.
It's not going to sound like it's very high. It's number 10 on my list, but when you think about all of the quality movies they've put out, like, it could be argued that is pretty high for a movie like that had like a production issue when the directors got switched up and yada, yada, yada. So needless to say, as much as I liked Ant-Man, I was very excited for Ant-Man and the Wasp. Pretty much as soon as Infinity War ended in April, I was ready to see this movie because I was curious if it was going to touch on those events. And of course, we'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, I was pretty pumped for this movie.
It's 11th on my list, by the way, so we're pretty close on that one.
Yeah, we are.
So yeah, we both. So we're both pretty close as far as liking this movie. I think more than most people. Like I said, I think people kind of dismiss this movie a little bit, and maybe that has a lot to do with the fact that it did have production problems. And I mean, it was a long time running. I think when they announced, if I remember correctly, like when they announced Iron Man at San Diego Comic-Con the first time, they also had Edgar Wright talking about Ant-Man. So this movie has been the first movie was in development for a really long time. And so sure. That never occurred to me that also might be play a part. So I appreciate that you brought it up. But like we do with every review, we kind of give a general overview as the first segment, and we call it broad strokes. So how'd you feel about Ant-Man and the Wasp?
So overall, obviously, for me, I think Marvel can add this to their long list of movies that's going to get a positive review from my standpoint. I really did enjoy a lot of this movie. However, I will say that I had higher expectations for this movie compared to what was delivered. I feel like there were some issues with the story and how it flowed at certain points. But again, I don't want to dismiss the fact that I really did enjoy this movie. I thought it was really funny and that it served the characters well.
Yeah, like you said, per usual, we're pretty close on most of the movies that we review, and Ant-Man and the Wasp is no different. So I definitely think that we needed a movie like this after Infinity War, the gut punch that was Infinity War. This movie definitely lightened the load a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily think or say that it's as funny as the Guardians movies are, but it's pretty up there for me, like as far as one of the funnier Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, which is saying a lot because those movies are kind of shit on by some DC fans that they're just kids movies and they're just trying to be comedies and whatnot. But go fuck yourself. Anyways, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, but the fact that we both really liked the most recent run of Ant-Man in the comic books, and those comic books were written by Nick Spencer, who is one of my favorite Marvel writers. And I think that in that comic book, they really captured what I really like about Scott Lang as a character. And I think that this and the first Ant-Man movie really captures that personality really well, that most recent run of Ant-Man did so well. So I definitely appreciated that. I, like you, had some problems with the story that we'll get into here in a little bit, but overall, it was exactly what I wanted from an Ant-Man movie. All right, so let's jump right into the story. How'd you feel about Ant-Man and the Wasp?
So like I mentioned in broad strokes, this is where I had my biggest issues with the movie. But again, I don't want it to be lost that I really did enjoy it. So I'm going to start with some positives and then I'll kind of wrap up with the issues I had. So I appreciated that this movie continued the feel of the first movie and was really light. I know you brought this up in your broad strokes, but when you think about it, this is the third Marvel Cinematic Universe movie that we've had this year, and the two before it, Black Panther and Infinity War, carried a ton of weight. So to compare this to those movies, it's kind of fluffy, and normally I'd be indifferent to that, but I think that it was needed from a cinematic universe standpoint. So I was really relieved to just kind of sit back and enjoy the adventure. I think it's important to note when the atmosphere to a movie like this feels fluffy, like I said, it also runs the risk of feeling shallow, but I don't think that this movie was shallow at all. Part of it is that we know these characters and we're invested in what's going on with all of them, but I think that it shows some really good storytelling as well, especially from like Peyton Reed, the guy who did Bring It On, apparently. Just because these are personal stakes in this movie and not issues that are going to impact the entire world like Infinity War and Black Panther, it doesn't mean the audience can't be invested, and this movie shows that there's still a place for very personal stories in the Marvel Cinematic Universe after Infinity War. Character-wise, I appreciate the character development that we get with characters like Scott and Hope, and I think that bringing the Wasp in this movie was a great choice, and I really enjoyed their partnership. So all of that stuff was great. As far as what I didn't like, it mostly has to do with the villains. Unfortunately, we're kind of back to that place. And when we used to talk about how much we love these movies, about how shallow the villains were, they had kind of turned the tide there. But I think this was kind of a step back. I thought that Ghost was really lame, and Sonny Birch, who was played by Walton Goggins, was completely out of place and didn't need to be in this movie at all. I also disliked the quantum realm stuff, which is a big deal because that's what this movie revolves around. I think it slows the movie down quite a bit, and it takes away from the stakes of the quantum realm that were placed in the first movie. And then, just little one-offs. There were some cringeworthy details with the character of Janet Van Dyne that I won't spoil, but basically some of the stuff in the introduction of her character just did not hit for me. So, with the good, there's bad, but at the end of the day, from a story standpoint, I will say definitely more good than bad.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I'm going to do it kind of opposite of what you did, is I'm going to talk about the biggest thing or the biggest gripe that I had with this movie. And we talked a little bit about this. Actually, I talked a lot about this when we reviewed Black Panther. I loved how that film felt so isolated from the regular or the overall MCU. And I really think since the first Avengers movie, is really hard to have a true standalone MCU film, because it's like, why wouldn't they help each other? They know of each other. Why wouldn't they help each other? And like I said in the intro, I was really curious to see how they were going to justify him not being in the events of Infinity War. And I think they tried to justify it, why he wouldn't step in. You had him being on house arrest, and then of course the polarities, or whatever comic book science word that they used to kind of justify, like, this was the only time that they could go in and save Janet, because in the next, like, it wouldn't happen like this for the next 100 years or whatever bullshit that they said. And so I just don't understand, given what we see with Scott in Captain America Civil War. Like, he was able to drop everything. He was willing to risk everything in his life to help out Captain America because he knew that this was a big deal, especially considering the stinger, which of course we won't spoil and we won't get into. But how do you see what's going on in New York, being Scott Lang, and not want to help? Like, I get that they have their own trouble right now, but I would assume that Thanos would trump everything. And so that really bugged me, given the things that we've seen with the character in the past, that he wouldn't drop everything and try to help. I mean, I don't know how much he would have been able to help, but I just don't see that him not dropping everything and wanting to help. Like I said, they tried to justify it a little bit, but I just don't think that they did a good enough job. So what else? Speaking of comic book science, it was really strong in this movie. They did a ton of science sounding words. They just spit out a lot of like just science mumbo jumbo that it got so bad that at a certain point I just kind of tuned it out. And I do love that at one point they kind of poked fun at themselves. I think Scott said something along the line of like, do you guys just put quantum in front of everything? And so that joke, that kind of meta little poke at themselves really kind of brought me back into it, because I was getting a little irritated the fact that they just was like spouting off all these science sounding words, and it definitely bothered me. I did kind of talk about the comic a little bit earlier and how I really liked this adaptation of Scott Lang in this movie being really tied into the character that I know in the comic book. And that goes along the lines of Cassie as well. I think in the comic book, one of the things that I really liked about the most recent run of Ant-Man is the fact that Cassie is kind of his anchor. Like everything that he is motivated to do in the comic book is because he wants to do better for his daughter. And that she's kind of the heart of the story in that most recent run of the comic book. And I love that they kind of brought that into Ant-Man and the Wasp. She's in the first movie, but it doesn't feel like his motivation is completely tied to her, and I feel like she's more of that anchor in this movie, and so I definitely appreciate that. And of course I love their dynamic together, which I will get into in the performances. Speaking of dynamic, I really liked that Hank and to a lesser extent Hope were pissed at Scott because of what happened with Captain America Civil War, because I think that Hank and Scott's dynamic is best when they're kind of at odds with each other. You see that a little bit in the first Ant-Man, and I just think that that dynamic is really interesting to watch. Not just interesting, but also kind of funny. They have some good back and forth that I really enjoyed in this movie, and I think that they're at their best when they're kind of at odds with each other, and you get that a lot in this movie. I, like you, did not care at all about Ghost. Like, I think they try to make her an interesting kind of complicated villain. I guess I could use villain in quotes because they do try to kind of make her a sympathetic character, but I just didn't buy it. I just didn't really care about her at all. I felt like she was more of a plot device than anything else to kind of keep the story moving a little bit and kind of keep the characters moving in a literal and metaphorical sense. I guess she added a little bit to the action that we'll get into here in a little bit. There was a couple of cool action scenes, especially between her and the Wasp, that I did enjoy. But for the most part, I just didn't really buy her story at all. Speaking of cool action scenes, which I'll get to later, I did enjoy Hope becoming the Wasp in this movie. I think that it definitely added a breath of fresh air. I think this movie could have easily became stale if they didn't add that aspect to this movie. I just love that she's presented as this badass woman in the first movie, and you really get to see that in the second movie. So I did appreciate that quite a lot.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with most everything you said, man.
All right, so let's move on to performances. How'd you feel like everybody did in Ant-Man and the Wasp?
I thought all of the performances were good for the most part. I think with the performance segment we do, it's a lot easier to complain about who wasn't good than who is good. And this movie, I mean, my issues are definitely with the villains. Like I said in the story, I don't think that Hannah John Kamen, who plays Wasp, or no, I'm sorry, who plays Ghost, I do not think she was great as Ghost. And I also expect more out of Walton Goggins. He was pretty much Boyd Crowder from Justified in this movie, and yeah. I think that he's a phenomenal actor, and he kind of phoned it in a little bit. But in all fairness, the part that he was written was not great either. So I don't know that if it's more of a story issue or a performance issue, but definitely had some moments where I rolled my eyes at the performances of those two actors specifically because the villains weren't great. I do think that from a comedic standpoint, like Scott's friends all continue to be really funny. I don't think T.I. is a great actor, but he's not has to do a whole lot. But Michael Pena is fantastic, and I really like David. I can't pronounce his last name. Daskmalchian or whatever, who plays Kurt, who plays his Russian friend. No way I got his name even close. It was more of a mumble. But another addition that kind of surprised me, and I don't know that you'll agree with me because this guy doesn't have a lot of range, is Randall Park. I thought that he was really
Yeah, his
funny.
character was fun.
Yeah, he was really funny in this movie, and obviously brings that levity to it as well. But yeah, like everybody who returned from the previous movie, like Paul Rudd, Evangeline Lilly, Michael Douglas, were all great. I guess the other newcomer I haven't talked about is Michelle Pfeiffer, but if I'm being honest with you, she doesn't really do a whole lot in this movie, so it's hard to really get into her performance too much. I mean, she's fine. Same with Lawrence Fishburne, like he's fine as well. My only like legitimate complaints were around, like I said, the two villains.
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, I do agree with most of what you said. I have very similar things on many of the things that you mentioned, but I think that, at least from my perspective, it seemed like Paul Rudd got a lot of shit when he was cast, and I might have included in a little bit of that, but I think he really works as Scott Lang. His appeal as a character is that, yeah, he is the superhero, but he's really bad at being a superhero. And I think Paul Rudd is great at doing that. And of course, his comedic timing is great. And that's really, really important in this movie. Speaking of Rudd, I think that him and his daughter, who is played by Abby Ryder Fortson, their chemistry is great in this film. And like I said, that's really important for me, for this character, because she's always going to be that anchor that is going to really motivate Scott. And that's really important in this movie. And I think that if their chemistry together didn't work, then I think part of this movie wouldn't have worked for me. Like you said, I think Michael Pena does a really good job. I don't think that he necessarily stole the show like he did in his few scenes in the first movie, but I think that he is great. And I think his one big scene in this movie was probably better than the one that we saw, or I guess we saw it a couple of times in the first movie. I thought that it was just so well done in this one versus the first one, which you don't always see in movies like this, especially I would say with comedy sequels. Like, to do that same bit in a next movie usually doesn't work as well as it did in this one. So I definitely appreciated that. His two buddies, they didn't do anything for me in this movie. They didn't move the needle at all for me, but they weren't really given a whole lot of screen time. This movie had a lot of other things going on, so you really couldn't give them the screen time that I don't want to say that they necessarily deserved, because like you said, T.I. is not a good actor, so maybe not give him as much screen time. But yeah, they just didn't have a whole lot going on in this movie. So I think the little that they're in it is pretty funny, but for the most part, they weren't that great. Speaking of not getting a whole lot of screen time, I completely agree with you with Walton Goggins. He doesn't really do a whole lot in this movie. He's kind of wasted in it. And he's really, honestly, if we're being completely honest, like, he hasn't really taken over a role like he did in Justified. Like, he was in Tomb Raider and he wasn't really great in that movie either, but he was so good in Justified that he's always going to get the benefit of the doubt for me. Like, yeah, he did kind of seem like he was phoning it in, but he wasn't really given a whole lot of work with. So when you're kind of given those two options, I'm definitely going to lean towards the fact that he just wasn't given a whole lot to work with. So he's always going to get the benefit of the doubt for me, because I think he's fantastic. And like you, I didn't buy Ghost at all. And I'm not sure with her if it was necessarily her performance, because I thought she was fine in Ready Player One. So I think she's an all right actress. I just didn't like the villain. So kind of with Walton Goggins, I'm going to kind of give her the benefit of the doubt. Now, of course, she didn't blow me away in Ready Player One, because she kind of just has a bit part in it, but I didn't think she was bad. So I don't think she's a bad actress. I just don't think that I really bought into the character.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like we're on the same page there. And I think this might go back to story a little bit, and I don't want to break up our review too much, but who do you think Walton Goggins' character works for?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, he kind of teases that a lot.
So I read a theory online that it's Norman Osborn.
That would be really cool. I mean, yeah, I would dig that. I mean, you would think with the tech angle that would make sense. That would be really cool if they end up tying that in. I don't know. I mean, it seems like they probably have this figured out. But I don't know. Maybe it's one of those instances where they're kind of teasing something and they'll figure it out down the line.
Yeah, this theory I read like has this whole thing like Marvel's told Sony not to use Norman Osborn in their spin-off movies, and they have plans for him and yada yada yada, and that's why they think that that's who the character would be working for. And I mean, you allude to it so much in this movie, it almost has to be somebody big. But
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
yeah, I'm getting a couple years ahead of myself, I think. But I was just curious if you had any guesses.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense, and that would be really cool, and maybe Walton Goggins gets his due in later Marvel movies, because, like I said, he's wasted in this one.
For sure, man.
All right, so action.
Yeah.
I was waiting for you to talk.
I didn't know if you were going to keep going. I thought the action was really good. My one complaint around the action is that all of the big set pieces in this movie you saw in the trailers.
Yes.
So for me, there wasn't like any surprise. I think that there were a couple points where Giant Man kind of comes out, and you saw both of those points in the trailers. Like at some point, you just have to let things be a surprise, and Marvel's typically pretty good about that. So I was surprised that I kind of knew all of the different set pieces going into the movie. I would have definitely liked to seen some other points that weren't spoiled already in the trailers. But I mean, what was in there was good. I feel like they did better with the action in this movie than they did the first one. I think that they got a lot more creative with the manipulation of size, and everything was a lot more fun. I thought Wasp kicked a lot of ass, which is great because, you know, in the first movie, she's the one teaching Scott how to fight. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not complaining about the action. I just would have liked to have been surprised by it a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that when I was watching the movie, but that does make sense. Like every big action sequence you'd seen in the movie or you'd seen in the trailer already. So that is kind of a bummer. But overall, I mean, I enjoyed the action in the first one. I thought that they kind of mixed the action with a lot of like fun elements, like them being small and kind of fighting near the toy train set. Like I thought that was fun, and I think that they mixed that really well in this movie again. Like the big Pez dispenser, like I thought that was fun, and just the way that they drove the cars. But again, like you said, which again I think is a really good point, is you see all of that in the trailers, the various trailers. So that does kind of bum me out a little bit. I hadn't thought of that, but again, I loved Hope in this movie. I love that we finally get to see her as Wasp. But like I said in the story, they tease her being this badass in the first one, and you finally get to see that. And yeah, even though you do get to see a little bit of the trailer, I do appreciate how much ass she does kick.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so star rating, Ant-Man and the Wasp. What'd you think?
I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5.
Per usual, we're pretty much on the same page, and we're exactly on the same page with a star rating. I'm going to give it 3.5. I really, after getting out of the movie, wanted to give it a 4 because I really thought that it was just a lot of fun. Like I said, I think it's one of the funnier Marvel Cinematic Universe movies that we've seen so far, but the whole Avengers Infinity War thing, that whole plot line really bugged me quite a lot the more I thought about it. So I had to knock it down to 3.5.
All right. Sounds good, man.
All right. So we didn't really talk about particular examples of how funny Ant-Man is. We just kind of talked in general terms, at least I did, with how much I really enjoyed the comedy in this movie. And so I kind of wanted to talk more in particulars about our favorite jokes from this movie. And so that's what Nerd Favorite's going to be this week, is what your favorite joke or bit from Ant-Man and the Wasp was. And for me, there's a couple of them, and I did enjoy, like I said, that meta poke at themselves earlier that I talked about in the story about the comic book science, but that's not my favorite joke in this movie. My favorite joke, and it was kind of just how I reacted to the joke and how I was kind of thinking as they were talking, and that is the hide and seek joke in this movie. So they describe a scene where, well, Paul Rudd kind of gets like this memory where he's playing hide and seek, and he describes it to Hope and Hank, and they're kind of piecing it together that it was a memory from Hope's childhood, and she said that she always hid in this one spot when she played hide and seek with her mom. And as she was saying that, I was thinking in my head, I was like, that's not how hide and seek works. And then Paul Rudd's character, Scott Lang, goes, I don't think that you understand that game. And I thought that was so hilarious because I was thinking the exact same thing as she was telling him that. I was like, that's so weird. Like, why would you hide in the same spot? And then Scott Lang, of course, says that and kind of makes fun of her. And it's really kind of a one-off line because they never really go back to it. And they kind of ignore that he even said it because he kind of said it under his breath. And then they just kind of move on. And that's the type of humor that you see a lot in Guardians of the Galaxy, and that's the type of humor that I really appreciated in this movie.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I was sitting there thinking, like, why would you hide in the same spot? Yeah. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So I really appreciate that, he points that out at that point. But for me, my favorite joke that like made me laugh longer than anybody in the theater, and I don't know why. Like I'm gonna explain it, and it's probably not gonna sound too incredibly funny, but there are these seeds planted by that Kurt, Scott's Russian friend. They're talking about Ghost and her abilities, and he talks about Baba Yaga, who is like this Russian boogeyman essentially. And there's a point where Walton Goggins' character has the three of Scott's friends tied up, and Ghost appears out of nowhere, and they freak out, and he goes, Baba Yaga. And then she ends up phasing away again, and he starts doing like this little nursery rhyme that just had me in stitches. It was like Baba Yaga comes at night, and I don't know why, but I really, really liked that joke. It was so funny to me. So that would, I guess, be my favorite because I laughed way longer than anybody else in the theater for unknown reasons.
Yeah, I liked that. I don't think that they were going for this, but I like that it was kind of a nod to John Wick because, of course, in the first movie, that's what they call him because he works for the Russian mob. So I thought that was kind of fun as well. So I did get kind of an added kick from that. All right, so that's it for episode 197 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. As we always do, like I said earlier, we're going to go ahead and pimp our other stuff. So most of you are already probably stopped listening. But for those that stuck around, you can subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio. Basically, any good podcatcher you use, we're on it. You can also check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. It has all of the cool things that I mentioned earlier. You can also comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerds You're Looking For. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Google+. You can also email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt,
we are the Nerds You're Looking For. Take it easy, guys.
Later, guys.